Hey Skywatchers, this week we talk with William Lyne. He's the author of several books, including the recent Pentagon Aliens. This is one of the first books to cite Nikola Tesla's research and science used in the technology that powers flying saucers and other anti-gravity type crafts often seen in the sky. So, as Skywatchers point their cameras upward to document the illegal aerosol operations, they're also documenting strange craft, such as triangles, spheres, and disks. Our guest says there are no aliens. Nearly all of the UFO craft witnessed each year are made by ours, he says, in the ours or theirs question. For many reasons these days, black-budget technology is hovering over the homes of millions. So consistently, some Skywatchers can set their watch to the sightings and start taping. Lyne says the public has been intentionally misled and dumbed down since the early 1900s so that they associate aliens instead of human beings with exotic flying craft. Fine, with aliens such as greys and reptilians out of the equation, maybe it'll be easier to learn how to make one or increase the chances to fly in one without a full cavity search. We hear fantastic accounts as Lyne describes his close-range sighting of a flying saucer in the Southwest. Again, we don't want to detract from the ongoing spraying by military cargo tankers across the planet. Our past guests, such as Boyd Bushman and Scott Stevens, have reminded Skywatchers and activists that superpower military technology is 100 years ahead of what we all know of in the public sector. Now, Airship did remind me that UFOs have appeared in medieval art and paintings hundreds of years ago, and of course the chopper and other flying craft carved in ancient Egyptian stone. Lyne's theory is not airtight. I guess we're reminded of how complex the ours or theirs question really is. Let's have a listen. Welcome, William, to Skywatch Radio.
Well, I'm glad to be here.
Excellent. So, William, you wrote a number of books, one of them being Pentagon Aliens, and that is actually a look at the craft that the government have been actually involved with creating, building. These are craft and machines that people see in the sky and think ET or aliens are, but really more likely that they're made by the United States government or maybe private corporations.
Well, the smoking gun is this, is that so much, when you look back over it for the last 60 years, so much energy has been put into creating the impression that these are alien craft. And if that was something the government was being truthful about, then they wouldn't be saying that. That would be hidden. There are all these secrets the government has. It's strange. The secret that these are alien craft is not a secret. It's just, So you see what I'm saying? What they don't want you to know is not going to be said because they control the media. I think that's become rather apparent in a few years how much control over the media the government really has. Yes, they have been brainwashing the public ever since the end of World War II about these ships being from outer space. And the government has definitely been behind it. The first press release that was issued after the Roswell incident, for instance, was issued by the government, and it claimed that there was an alien UFO which had crashed and they had alien bodies. So that was the government that initiated that first bit of false information. And then they turned the other way and started denying it after they had issued this information. So, I think it's been apparent to me all along. I never considered these ships to be anything but man-made ships from the very beginning when I first heard about them. But you figure 62 years how much further ahead of the public the government is, because the government and the corporations that build these ships, because they've been dumbing the public down all that time.
Let's go back a little bit and talk about how you got involved with this. You were witness to a flying saucer at close range with 7 other people back in 1953.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit in the Skywatchers about this sighting and how that influenced you to get into this subject?
Well, actually, I had started looking for these craft since 1946 when I first heard about them from oil field pumpers. They were traveling in southern New Mexico a lot to service oil field pumps. and they spotted them a lot, and they were referred to as flying discs at that time. So I was looking for these things. I was an aircraft nut since the time I was 3 or 4 years old. So, you know, I was really intrigued by these flying discs, and I wanted to know about them. The first big sighting that occurred in my family, which I wasn't party to, was on the first day of the Korean War, June 1st, 1950. One appeared across the street from our house, but I was in the Davis Mountains. I didn't get to see it. It was there for 15 minutes. The next day, there were 2 there, and they were there for 30 minutes. My friend Ken took photographs of this, and he was paid $250 for the negatives and the photos and signed a non-disclosure agreement. He now claims that he doesn't remember it, but of course he did work for the CIA quite a few years. And so, you know, I asked him, did they wipe your mind? And he said they might have. Anyway, that's beside the point. It was that was 1950. It was 3 years before I got to see one.
Tell us a little bit about that. I mean, you were standing there with 7 other people. How close was this?
It was within 300 feet, and which is nothing. That's the end of the block.
What was the shape of it and the exterior? Like, could you see all that?
Well, the shape of the ship was like 2 walks stuck together, 2 hemispheres, not quite, or semispheres, a better description. They were about a quarter of a sphere, each quarter stuck together to form like clamshell fashion to form the ship. And oddly enough, there were striations, little grooves in the surface, similar to what a walk has. I figure those grooves were an attempt at stealth technology back in 1953. But the ship, when I first spotted it, was precessing at a large angle, maybe 45-degree angle precession. And I was turning an ice cream freezer at the time. My sister was sitting on a towel on top of the freezer to hold it down. And I just happened to be staring up into the sky, and there this thing was. And I screamed, "Look at that," you know. And so the other people looked at it, except the woman on my left was Mrs. Humphreys, who was a tenant of ours and we had some apartments, and she was a tenant, and she was also the chief of aerial gunnery instruction at Sarasota Sarasota, Florida, for the U.S. Army Air Corps during World War II. So she didn't look at the ship but once. She just glanced at it, and then she watched me while I watched the ship, and I kept pointing at the ship and trying to get her to look at it, but she was just interested in watching my reactions. And I figure she was probably one of the first people to see the film that was shot of the Foo Fighters over Germany. Since she had to instruct the gunners on how to shoot these things, she would be one of the first people that would see those films. I later saw the actual film when I was in the Air Force, and it just happened to be the same intelligence organization that took those films in World War II. That's the one I was a member of in Ohio. So, what a coincidence. That ship was precessing very large angle in about 2 precessions per second. And then it suddenly took off and began to move faster. The precession diminished in angle but increased in frequency until it was just a high-frequency wobble. Then it did 2 90-degree turns straight down. It turned 90 degrees straight down, 90 degrees level again, dropped down about 100 feet to very close to the Earth, and then shot to the point of infinity in 3 seconds as I counted off 1001, 1002, 1003, and it was gone. So that ship would have had to been doing about 25,000 miles per hour, and it was on a due east course towards Fort Bliss, which is where Von Braun was brought after the war.
Did this craft have any markings on it?
No, there was no markings that I could see. There was no windows. Of course, it was so close to us, I couldn't see on top very well. There could have been something up on top, but I don't think so. Because of the wild precession, I should have seen that if it was on top, and I didn't see anything. I finally concluded that they probably had image inverters on it, which would be small openings in the surface to view what was outside. But with the rapid precession, I would imagine that they would have a difficult time seeing anything, until it picked up speed. I think that it's probably having a malfunction at the time that I first spotted it. And the corona was just beautiful. It was putting off a what we call metallic color, rainbow-colored electrical discharge on the top. The bottom had a infrared glow. And I could only see that when the ship was precessing away from the sun. Then I could see the bottom glow. But otherwise, when the light's hitting it, it wasn't visible. So it was basically causing the air to glow. But it wasn't putting off the negative corona that was coming off the top. It was, when the ship moved, it left a trail of ions which scintillated, sparkled, and finally faded out. It was quite a beautiful phenomenon. It's easy to understand why people would describe these as being alien craft because it's so fantastic. However, it's just Tesla pyrotechnics, basically. Nikola Tesla invented these ships and sold them to Germany after the U.S. government turned down his offer to sell it to them first, and they weren't interested, so he sold it to the German Minister High Marine, and they developed this thing during the war. Now, one of the things that's interesting is, in regard to this, is the first flying saucer project, I figure, in America was actually conducted by the Germans at Los Alamos in the 1930s. And it was run by Wernher von Braun, who was here in the United States before World War II for 2 years. And some people have doubted that, but we have acquired photographs showing him in New Mexico. And we also have evidence that Nikola Tesla was here in New Mexico too. So, in New Mexico. And von Braun was a replacement for Willy Lyne, who was the original invitee of the American Rocket Society. But Lyne was sent over here probably just to spy on American rocketry because the rockets of Goddard were more successful than the German rockets. Liquid fuel rockets all were exploding before my friend Peter Van Dresser invented the first successful liquid fuel rocket engine. And he was distraught to the end of his life about the fact that Goddard had appropriated his invention and then handed it over to von Braun, which was what made the rocket program in Germany successful. Willy Lyne had defected and was living with Peter and Florence Van Dresser in their apartment in Greenwich Village in that 1930s period, and took out citizenship papers in 1937, but he was the real genius of American rocketry, and he's the one that trained von Braun. But von Braun was sent over here as a replacement because Lyne didn't have any intention of returning to Germany once he was out of there. And the minute that the military took over the American Rocket Society, Peter Van Dresser also quit because he was a pacifist and he didn't want anything to do with the military.
Is this all before Jack Parsons?
Jack Parsons is shown in a photograph with von Braun at Eden Valley, the firing range of Goddard in southern New Mexico, Dr. Robert Goddard. And you can see von Braun laying on the ground. He's probably only about 20, 21 years old or something like that. And a lot of people doubted my assertion that von Braun was here in New Mexico, but I had it right from the horse's mouth. Peter was here. He told me, he was the first one to tell me about it. And I talked to a number of other scientists at Los Alamos, and they all knew about it.
So what does this mean? I mean, for Skywatchers out there who are photographing and seeing specifically these white and red and sometimes black, even metallic-looking spheres, and they are spheres in shape, flying around. What do you know what those are?
The spheres are kind of a puzzle. We saw one in 2004. I have a friend in Italy, and he was here for a visit. And he and his wife and my son and I were having supper on a patio at a restaurant in Santa Fe after dark. It was around 9 o'clock, and one of these red spheres comes down, straight down, and goes down into northwest quarter of Santa Fe. And so we jumped in the car and went looking for it, and all we found was a roadblock. Very quickly they set up a roadblock over there because this thing apparently crashed in somebody's yard, but they evacuated the neighborhood under the false pretense that there was a meth lab over there in a car, of all things, because nobody found there was no meth lab. They said there was cars carrying the ingredients for a meth lab. Well, there was no car on that street when we went over there. The street was completely clean of cars, so where's your car with a meth lab in it? And then about a half hour later, a hazmat team showed up, probably from Los Alamos, and they were putting on their suits. And then there was another vehicle over about a block away, blocking the road, just trying to make it look like he was having car trouble, but he had a big Chevy Suburban basically blocking the street, keep people out of there without raising too much suspicion. And then a flare was fired to notify the hazmat team of where the ship went down. And we didn't see it on the ground. We didn't see them remove it. I don't know how they removed it, but they created this phony cover story the next day about a meth lab thing. That thing, they could be robot ships. Some of the ships are robot ships. A lot of them are. They use robot ships, and they equip them with GPS and artificial intelligence, so they can behave as if they're carrying intelligent life. They're programmed that way, but they can pre-program these things and send them out to gather data. Corporations actually use these things now.
Oh, I see. Now these, I mean, you hear about in the mass media the drones and which look like these weird-looking plane type that fly around. They're pretty big. Some of them, they look so primitive compared to these spheres, and some of them are glowing internally like there's a plasma field around them. Is that also happening?
They probably have many permutations of this technology for different purposes. I've seen some weird craft fly over me here where I live. I'm south of Santa Fe, so most of the ships that appear in this area are from Albuquerque. As you go up towards Santa Fe to the Sangre de Cristos, you got a lot the mountains up there. The ships that appear there are out of Los Alamos, and I've seen them go back to Los Alamos. But occasionally there's a ship over here that goes back to Los Alamos. I've seen these things fly over that were just more or less like they appeared to be some kind of frameworks, but they had periodically flashing lights, and I think those are related to the method of keeping these things aloft. Some of these lights are very bright, like high-powered electric discharges. That's how these ships operate, actually, is they use Tesla called it veritable ropes of air. It basically uses a beam to, let's say to hold the ship up, he shoots a beam, so there's a beam going straight up above the ship. And then electric discharges are shot up that beam. They're negative electrostatic discharges from Tesla's special single-terminal coil. And those are what create a momentum upward of the ship to suspend it. And then other beams are shot out to take the ship sideways. Now, those beams cannot be observed except by infrared scope. You can see them with an infrared scope, but ordinarily they're not visible with the naked eye. I've seen these years before I realized the significance of these beams, until I found that reference in some Tesla interviews where he referred to these veritable ropes. And then I witnessed a rope over a ship over Vandenberg Air Force Base in 2000, and with a powerful infrared scope. And you looked up there and you saw what looked like was a star over the base, but it was too bright, and the altitude and appearance of it was too low to the altitude, So I looked at it with the infrared scope, and you could see the straight beam going right upwards from this ship, and it wasn't visible with the naked eye. And my friend Tim said, "Well, that must be an aberration in the lens." So I turned the scope sideways, and no, it still went straight up, so it wasn't an aberration. So that's when I first became aware of this beam system, and I knew how Tesla was creating these beams because of this special bulb that he developed. And and because I knew that you could shoot electrical discharges down the beam. The beam will carry a heavy current. And as far as I know, nobody knows exactly what kind of radiation that beam is. It comes off a special aluminum bulb, and initially the bulb had a vacuum tube around it, but Tesla figured out a way to make the bulb operate without a vacuum. But it basically is some sort of a beam that will carry a current, and its parent's not X-ray. It is penetrating. You can make a radiograph with it, just like an X-ray, except you don't have any dangerous radiation. That would be my answer to how these beams are created. The coil that Tesla developed was, he called it his method for producing DC current with high frequency, which means basically electrostatics. Basically, it was a way to generate electrostatics with an alternating high frequency current, and it's quite an interesting concept. This is part of the technology, and Tesla described this in the 1890s of how you could, when you did the electrostatic discharges, that the tubes of force would come back and impart momentum to the ship, basically. It was better described by J.J. Thomson, who tried to grab Tesla's credit on this after Tesla had given a lecture in England. As it were, you can't find these references anymore. They're hard to get hold of because being suppressed. I recently was going to buy a copy of a paper written by J.J. Thomson at the University of Bath in England, and just as I got ready to buy it, all the stuff disappeared from the website.
Oh, really?
I located the paper, but then the whole thing was taken. So somebody didn't want that old 1880 something or 1893, I think it was, paper. But I'm sure there are other copies. It was published in the international scientific journals in the 1890s. Generally called electromagnetic momentum. That's what the papers refer to.
What I'm getting from you is around this period where Nikola Tesla was very active, of course, you had L. Ron Hubbard and Jack Parsons hanging out and maybe involved with nuclear weaponry also. But from there on, the public has been sort of dumbed down, like through the early 20th century till now, in regard to this level of technology?
That's true. The government has dumbed us down to the point that what the government has is, we have computers. We have no idea what the government has in the form of computers. In 1957, when I was in Air Force Intelligence, the Pravda, the Russian newspaper, would be printed and available just after, say, maybe midnight or something. It would be, a copy would put, the embassy would take a copy of it, put it on a military jet, and fly it to I believe it was Wendover Air Force Base in Massachusetts, and the paper would be put in a scanner, and which would scan and interpret it in 2 hours, printed out in English. And then that paper, by that time, the paper could be distributed to all the SAC bases before, the day was out. Every SAC base intelligence division would have a copy of Pravda in English. And so this was 1957. That technology wasn't available to the public until 35 years later. So that shows how far ahead what the government has. While we think we have these fantastic technologies, I personally think that Bill Gates is nothing more than a person who leaks obsolete government technology to us. In other words, the whole Windows system is something the government was using, 35 years ago or something, So we're getting old technology that's already obsolete.
That's what I've heard of. We've had some guests on, such as Boyd Bushman, and he had mentioned it's like 70 to 100 years, I think, more advanced than what's in the public sector.
We'll figure Tesla invented this stuff over a century ago, and he had developed it to the point of, actual practicality by 1914. So, that's a lot of suppression. they grabbed so much of his. He had all kinds of discoveries that they kept, and they never disclosed them since 1943 when they grabbed it when he died.
I was doing some research, and it was I saw that it was said that his technology is more carefully guarded than the technology to make a hydrogen bomb.
Oh yeah. Well, I found the hydrogen bomb plans on the open shelves when that first library was opened up in Los Alamos in 1979. Jimmy Carter had a technology transfer effort in progress, and they created this library called the National Security Research Center. They later changed it to the J. Robert Oppenheimer Research Center. But I found the hydrogen bomb plans on this open shelf. I was angered because I couldn't find information I was trying to get on hydrogen technology, and there were the hydrogen bomb plans. Well, some guy from Harvard, I discussed this with a guy from Harvard at a restaurant shortly after leaving Los Alamos, and he went up there, made photocopies of it, went to Harvard and wrote an expose on it, and it caused kind of a sensation. But I felt like that those bomb plans were put on the shelf just because there's a certain element of people who wanted that all shut back up again. They didn't want that library to be open. And now you can't get in there even with a badge. By the way, I mentioned in my book an old barn up there, which I bought an apparatus. That one day, I went to the salvage sales at Los Alamos, and they had a bunch of old wooden forms that were taken out of an old barn which is in Los Alamos, in part of the classified areas. And apparently they didn't know what this barn was all about, because these apparati that were in this barn were really old. Some of them went back to long before the Manhattan Project, and I bought a couple of forms that were for a tuning coil, but the wire had been removed. And then there was a large form for a conical coil that was probably 10 feet high and probably 10 or 12 feet wide at the base, but all the wire was removed. And then I wrote about this in my book, and how I thought that this form that I had handwriting that it was identical to Nikola Tesla's on it. So the lab, finding out what they didn't know, that they had a historical place on their hands at Los Alamos, they went out and got all this stuff back. They didn't come to me, but they went to some of the other salvage dealers and acquired all this stuff back, sealed up the old barn, and nobody can get in it. And it is surrounded by radioactive neptunium, which is probably just put there to keep everybody away from it. So, in other words, the lab wasn't even aware they had this old barn there, or what it was used for. And it was where the P2 project was carried out by von Braun.
What is the P2 for Skywatchers?
That was the first flying saucer project. It was based on Tesla's technology, and it was done at Los Alamos in 1936 to 38 under the supervision of Wernher von Braun. At the same time, he was working in southern New Mexico with Goddard in rocketry. But I had asked my friend Peter if von Braun was working at Los Alamos, and he said yes. This was before the war. And furthermore, the old man that I talked to, who had worked as a laborer in that German project, referred to Dr. von Braun, and he couldn't figure out why he wasn't hired later at the Manhattan Project, after he'd worked in this first project as a laborer, and couldn't understand why he didn't get hired. He didn't know the difference between one project and the other. He just kind of thought they were one project.
Right.
But according to the propaganda out of Los Alamos, there was nothing there but a boys' ranch before the war, which incidentally J. Robert Oppenheimer went to. So there was an interesting thing, a bunch of Nazi scientists up there in Los Alamos before the war.
I mean, you could read all about how a group of Nazi scientists were shipped to the U.S. After the war.
Operation Paperclip, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, it's really funny that von Braun was here, and some of his associates were here with him, you see, before the war. But Peter always considered Goddard a traitor because he handed his rocket engine over to von Braun. And it was used on the B-2s and all the rest of the German rockets. Didn't make him very happy. But I didn't really pry into the flying saucer situation with Peter. I'm sure he must have known about it, but he wouldn't have been covered by any security agreement because it didn't exist at the time that he was familiar with this stuff. But I didn't realize that Peter didn't work for the government. I thought he was a Los Alamos scientist, but actually he had some dealings with the government, but he really wasn't one of those guys. He was a real genius, but he worked a lot in solar energy and other things. He was really way ahead of the others, all the other rocketeers with his engine design.
So here we are. It's 2008. Massive sighting in Stevensville, Texas. We are seeing a lot more sightings. I wanted to get to the question of the ours or theirs.
Well, my son and I saw 4 ships. In 2004, we went to Tyler, Texas, from the Santa Fe area. Going east, we saw a big UFO come down from high altitude, a large UFO come down and land over on the other side of Fort Worth. Well, we kept driving along the highway, and we saw a total of 4 of these. The last one we saw, we were close to Tyler, and the thing was actually landing near Tyler. That's where the landings were made, and these things were coming down from maybe 20, 30, 50,000 feet, real high altitude. They were coming down rapidly, and the last one we saw, we could see, you see the altitude in the highway is a little higher than where Tyler is. So we're actually looking down on this ship as it landed. We could see the top was darkened. After it came down and got ready to land, the electrical discharge on the top turned off. That was so it would drop. And then the bottom was all lit up brightly, and you could see that it lit the ground under it as it, the ground was, brightly lit underneath the ship as it landed. And the only thing we could find around there on the map was an old airfield called Rounds Field, which is now a small commercial airfield in Tyler. It's an old Army airfield, but there are a lot of underground salt mines in that area, an old salt mines. They used to mine salt. So there's a great deal of underground diggings there. There's this base, and it was probably General Dynamics doing experimental flights with craft they were building, test flights of craft they were building. And that big one they saw at Stephenville, which is just on the west side of Fort Worth, that's very close to where we saw the first ship when we first spotted them, the sequence of 4 ships that we spotted as we were driving. It was, 10, 11, 12 at night when we saw these things. It's just amazing that there wasn't anything said about those big ships we saw come down, with all the people that live in that area. Nobody mentioned it, or the newspaper didn't mention it. That ship that was spotted at Stevensville was probably just another big ship that General Dynamics had under development.
Well, that's a really good point that you bring up, because here in New York, I've seen objects in the sky over 9 million people. We see consistent aerosol spraying projects that are just unbelievable.
Well, we had chemtrails yesterday.
What is your knowledge of that operation? Do you have, aside from, it's military where they use it for over-the-horizon radar?
I don't believe that. They don't need it. They already got over-the-horizon backscatter radar, it's called.
Yeah.
They had it in 1957.
What do you think is going on? Are they manipulating, controlling weather?
I think they're manipulating, controlling people. I think they're using this to make people sick. Now, what they're trying to do, and this may sound extreme, but it's part of the eugenics. They want to kill off the weak and the old, so the Social Security system will work better and so forth. With so many people, there's a fear, I think, of the corporations and people that run everything that if we get too many people, they'll demand that the power be turned back to the people or something. You see, so basically, it's just a eugenics process. If you make everybody's lungs, people have respiratory problems. It's a big plus for the pharmaceuticals. If you kill off a lot of people, then you get rid of the weak and the sick. And I get respiratory problems every time they do this. I've got one today. I didn't have it yesterday until chemtrails were sprayed. So I've got respiratory distress today.
Yeah, we hear you coughing. The chemtrail cough.
I was fine yesterday. It was very clear yesterday before that. Mycoplasma, all sorts of possibilities. But they say that mycoplasma has been found in dust.
We're looking into links about whether this material is linked to Morgellons disease.
Yeah, there's a doctor in Santa Fe got his license pulled because he was treating people for Morgellons. They're claiming, these government people and your American Medical Association people are claiming that it's a myth, that it doesn't really exist.
Yeah, and the CDC had recently said that they're going to look into this. I don't know how far they're going to look into something like that, but it's really disturbing. I feel so bad for the people who have those bugs crawling under their skin. It's just, it's such a hellish torture to be afflicted with.
Yeah, well, there's other things that can cause similar problems, like scabies, which you can pick up anywhere. Actually, the stuff's all over the place. People have it and don't even know they have it, but it creates similar problems, with these little mites that bore under your skin and lay eggs and cause little lesions, and you itch. And most people thought it was from uncleanliness, and that really doesn't have anything to do with it. You can pick it up just by touching something that where these things can be,
Oh, right.
But this Morgellons seems to be a different type of illness, and and some people, as you say, have said this is coming out of these chemtrails. I don't know about some of the analyses because I'm not really that familiar with it. I just know for a fact that they found barium and aluminum in these things, and that's enough to make you pretty sick.
You bet, William. I just for Skywatchers just tuning in, I want to tell them that we're talking with William Lyne. He's author of Pentagon Aliens, and another book called Occult Ether Physics, and another book called Occult Science Dictatorship that we're going to talk with him about in a little bit. But some of the research that we've done has, from video and photographic evidence, we often see a lot of spray activity before and after large weather systems. So we've interviewed Jerry Smith, who's author of Weather Warfare and HARP, The Ultimate Weapon of the Conspiracy, I think is the title. But he really goes into some detail about how HARP is used and in conjunction with the aerosol operation to modify and control weather. But we're talking with you because what we've also seen is we're getting contacted by different Skywatchers around the country who are photographing and videotaping these white spheres that are often also seen diving in and out of trails.
Well, I don't know that there's any real connection between the UFO activity. I mean, they're going to be tooling around up there because they don't do anything but experiment with these things, apparently. In order to keep it secret, they have to continue to come up with new secret technologies to test on these ships. I mean, that's just one theory that I have, is that they continually come up with new technologies, and that way keeps it under the secrecy umbrella. But I don't believe that anybody in the normal military has any access to this technology. It's a very high level. It's almost like a whole organization above all the military. They have little robot ships that are used by corporations. They're used actually to find minerals, and these are called autonomous remote vehicles, ARVs, not alien reproduction vehicles, as some idiots have thought. They're actually autonomous remote vehicles, ARV, and they are small ships that are robot. They're pre-programmed and sent out to gather data. They use global positioning system, and they have gamma lasers to penetrate the earth or the ocean and find minerals underneath. And this is really just an extension of an old technology that was developed in the 1940s to find minerals by using a gamma emitter, but they couldn't read the logs at the time. And in 1961, when I was working for Union Oil Company in California, one of the engineers I knew there figured out how to read the logs and find the minerals. They had the reflections, they had the logs, but they didn't know what the wave signs were for certain minerals. So now they have a more penetrating type of device, a gamma laser. So these things go out, they fly in a grid and bring the data back. It's got all the coordinates on it, and they're totally autonomous. They pre-program them.
What do these craft look like?
They're little flying saucers.
How big are they?
I don't know. I just know for a fact that they're using them.
Interesting.
And
is there a website or?
No, you're not going to find any website on it. This is really very unusual information. But I got the information from a reliable source, and I know they use GPS on this. As a matter of fact, one of the corporations that developed the technology is the one that developed GPS. These things can get all sorts of minerals under the ocean and under the earth. And meanwhile, the small poor boy oil company doesn't have access to this information. But the big boys have the access to it, and they know exactly where the oil is. The rest of these guys are stuck with primitive technology like seismic. They go out and set off a blast and get a sounding, or they try to use gravimetric processes and so forth. But this is really the ultimate in finding minerals.
Skywatchers, that was William Lyne, author of Pentagon Aliens. He lives in New Mexico. You've been listening to Skywatch Radio on NewYorkSkywatch.com.